Well, President Xi Jinping gives the keynote speech at this weekend's Boao Forum on the Chinese island of Hainan, attended also by business icons like Bill Gates and George Soros. One friend of China will not be there, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, now pondering his next move in the escalating threats uttered from Pyongyang. It's now got to the point where you have a former CIA director, Michael Hayden, saying the possibility of North Korea funding a nuclear attack is somewhere between extremely remote and zero, while at the same time saying the current situation is extremely dangerous. Note the use of the word extremely. But what does this really mean? Welcome again to Agenda. I'm Colin Chapman. And with me is Stratfor's Rodger Baker. Rodger, this is an issue where the volume keeps being turned up, alarm bells are sounding, but is there any risk of real conflict?
Well, I think, one, in looking at his statements, you have to look at the difference between nuclear and conventional warfare. The North Koreans have developed a nuclear device that they are able to test underground. It's highly unlikely that the North Koreans have developed a deliverable nuclear weapon. And therefore, North Korea striking with a nuclear weapon at South Korea, and particularly the ability of the North Koreans to strike at Japan or the United States, is extremely remote. At the same time, North Korea does have a very, very large conventional force. That conventional force is forward deployed. And the North Koreans and the South Koreans are exchanging certain types of rhetoric. They're both adjusting their rules of engagement, or at least claiming to be adjusting those. And therefore, the chance of an accidental or a event triggered off of misunderstanding or miscalculation could occur. And that's, I think, where the danger comes from. The danger is not coming from the carefully choreographed moves of the North Koreans to try to shape the psychological battlefield, or even the counter moves by the United States to play in the same sort of psychological space, but it comes from the potential for a miscalculation or a misunderstanding at a very small level that could quickly escalate out of control.
Rodger, what are the chances of the two major powers, China and the United States, coming to an agreement on a way out of this conflict?
Well, the United States and the Chinese are going to have some meetings coming up in the not-too-distant future. Certainly North Korea is going to be in discussion during those. The United States, however, has really tried to stick to its policy of ignoring the North Koreans to death at this particular moment, that they really want to emphasize that the pattern of North Korea being able to raise tensions in order to trade down to close to the status quo for money and rewards is no longer a pattern that the U.S. is going to continue feeding into. And so in some sense, the impression and the face that the U.S. is putting on this is they are not willing to enter any form of negotiation at this time with the North Koreans until after the North Koreans reduce tension. So not enter talks to bring tensions down, but to wait until tensions come down to enter talks. The Chinese have been trying to play off the North Korean threat as something that, hey, it's going to get out of hand, the South Koreans might act soon, we really need to ratchet this back. And the Chinese are trying to say, hey, United States, you need to come to us so that we can talk to the North Koreans for you. And right now, the U.S. and the Chinese are on a very different page as to what to do about this crisis. Further, it's not entirely clear that the Chinese are suffering from this crisis right now. In fact, it's taken most of the world attention off of what had been focused on what was perceived as Chinese maritime aggression in the region, and it shifted it all to North Korea.
Inevitably, North Korea's escalating threats encourage the hawks, those in armchairs calling for action. But is there any preemptive military action that could be taken?
There really is no preemptive military action the South Koreans could take that doesn't risk triggering off a complete war. The problem is that what the North Koreans have that threatens South Korea is not necessarily the nuclear program. It's not even really the missile program. It's the frontline artillery. And there's no way to take out, to attack, to destroy that frontline artillery without basically triggering the response from North Korea to start shelling the greater Seoul Incheon area. So the South Koreans don't have a preemptive military move to deal with the North Koreans or to force the North Koreans back down. The North Koreans right now everybody's interpretation, at least from the government level and looking at the North Koreans, is that the North Koreans are not intent on actually triggering a war. That North Korea is just as concerned as everybody else about a war, and perhaps even more because although the South Korean economy may be devastated in the short term, the likelihood of the North Korean regime being able to continue in the long term is very, very low. So they will lose a war effectively. And the risk, though, is not in a conscious decision by the North Koreans or even a conscious preemptive decision by the South Koreans, but that the South Koreans feel after years of not physically responding to the North Koreans, they've had to change the impression that they would respond physically now, that they misinterpret an action by the North Koreans and they respond anyway.
Rodger, a few days ago, I happened to meet Alexander Zhibin, a North Korean expert from the Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He was once the tasked correspondent in Pyongyang. And he argued that the issue for Kim Jong-un was getting a guarantee that his regime would survive, and that once he got that, progress could be made. Do you see any truth in this?
I think there actually is some truth in that. The North Koreans, their entire policy that they've been pursuing is a policy of securing and strengthening the Kim regime. It's securing the elite. It's maintaining control within North Korea. And their pattern of raising tensions and backing down, and then they have to raise tensions higher the next time before they back down, is really, it's been going on for about 20 years. It's reaching its limits of efficacy, and the North Koreans are having to shift and adjust. The North Koreans, by pulling out of the armistice agreement, by the steps that they're taking, are trying to redefine any talks that happen, not as talks about reducing the North Korean nuclear program or pulling back on its missile development, but as talks about the fundamental status of security on the Korean Peninsula. And that really is something that the North Koreans would like to adjust. They have lived since the end of the Korean War under how they perceive under the guns of the United States, that they're constantly a threat from the much larger United States. And whether the U.S. really has an interest in going after North Korea or not doesn't matter to the North Koreans. They perceive that it does. For them, changing that dynamic, creating a peace accord with the United States, gaining recognition, formal recognition for their regime, gives them some sense of space. It gives them the ability internally to show how strong they are internationally, that even the United States now recognizes this regime, and that would give them some space to play around with some of their economic experimentation, maybe even open themselves up to a little bit more international trade and find some ways to attract some investment, particularly to build up North Korea's ailing infrastructure.
Of course, they've carried out one threat, albeit not a military one. They've blocked off access of South Korea's managers to the Kaesong industrial zone. Has that had any real impact?
Up to this point, we haven't seen a substantial impact yet on Kaesong, although the North Koreans have threatened to withdraw their own citizens as well. Most of the South Korean companies there are still encouraging their workers who are currently in North Korea to remain in North Korea and not leave, so only a small number are leaving. All indications are the factories are still operating, they're still producing, they still have a week or two or maybe more of raw materials and supplies that they can draw on to stay in action. The North Koreans in the past have disrupted operations during times of high risk and high crisis. And this looks like it's one of those types of situations again, although again, their threat to withdraw their workers may push it a little further. From the North Korean point of view, Kaesong is probably more important economically for them than it is for South Korea, although there's a lot of small South Korean companies operating there that could be seriously damaged if the facilities close. But for the South Koreans, it's much more psychologically important because it really is the centerpiece of South Korean policy towards North Korea. And it's that tiny piece that constantly keeps a connection between the two. And from the South Korean perspective, as long as Kaesong is open, they see it as a signal from the North that they're really not going back to confrontation.
Well, stay tuned to Stratfor to see how it plays out. Rodger Baker there, Ending Agenda. Thanks for being with us. Goodbye.